Welcome to Essex Wildlife Trust's Wilder Communities programme. This is the Pesticide Free Town webinar with Pesticide Action UK and our guest speaker, Nick Mole. And this was specifically designed for our benefit bugs topic. So this is our second session for 2023, and it's for our Team Wilder projects, which includes Urban Wildlife Champions, Wilder Towns, Wilder Villages, and Next Door Nature. It's great to see some councils on here today within our Wilder Towns, Wilder Villages project. I've got some familiar names on the screen, which is great. But just in case you don't know me or you're part of a council and I've yet to meet you, my name is Danielle Carbot and I'm the Wilder Communities Manager at Essex Wildlife Trust. I will be popping in my email into the chat for those who would like to contact me who have not got my email already. But just a couple of housekeeping things before we kick off. This is a webinar, so you can't put your camera or microphone on, but if you have questions, please pop them in the chat. You'll see at the top that there's sort of a chat bubble. If you press that, you can pop your questions in. We've made sure that there's some time at the end to answer these. I will try and answer any as we go through if they're nice and easy, but I will also pass some over to Nick at the end of the session, who I'm sure will be able to answer them a little more clearly. So without further ado, over to you, Nick. And yeah, thank you very much for agreeing to come on and share your expertise in Pesticide Free Town.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Right, I shall attempt to share my screen.
Worries. I can see that.
Is that all working?
Yep, all working. I can see that.
I should probably start at the beginning, shouldn't I? There we go. That's better. All right. So yeah. Hello, Essex. So I'm Nick from the Pesticide Action Network UK. We're the only charity in the UK that focuses on all aspects of pesticides, and our sort of overarching mission is to end the use of the most hazardous pesticides, promote sustainable alternatives and better agriculture. But we cover the whole range, as I said, from agriculture, where most pesticides are used, to the amenity sector, so sort of towns and cities, parks and green spaces, that sort of thing, and also people's homes and gardens, so the amateur use side of things. We've been operating for about 35 years or so, where we're part of a wider global network of sort of autonomous organisations, all focusing on their own things. But in those years, we've had a lot of success in both getting better regulation put in place and getting some of the most toxic pesticides, whether that's because of their effects on human health or the environment, banned globally or nationally or regionally or whatever it happens to be. I've personally been there for, I think, this is my 17th year now, working on pesticides and pesticide policy issues. So I've sort of seen most things to do with it, and we're in a quite an interesting situation at the moment in the UK, having left the EU and basically having to reset all our pesticide regulation and rebuild or construct all the bodies that were formerly look after pesticides that were formerly housed in Brussels. So that's quite a big change. So there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of threats to how we regulate pesticides in the UK. But it's quite exciting if you're into that sort of thing, which I am. So why are we concerned about pesticides and what they're doing? Well, pesticides are poisons, and just before we go any further, when I talk about pesticides, I mean all the sort of the sides that kill things. So whether that's insecticides, so to kill insects, herbicides to kill plants, fungicides, fungus, molluscicides, etc. So pesticides is the umbrella term for all of those things that come underneath it. So yeah, pesticides are poisons. They are designed with the express purpose of killing living organisms, and that is exactly what they do. The problem is they don't just kill the things that have been identified as pests that you want to get rid of, but they also have an impact on non-target species. And I've already said that agriculture is the biggest user of pesticides, and there is no escaping the fact that agriculture is playing, the way agriculture is undertaken currently and the use of pesticides are having a huge harmful impact on our biodiversity. They are driving to quite a huge extent the biodiversity crisis that we face at the moment. So since the 1970s, we've lost 50% of our farmland bird species, and the farmland bird index keeps showing that this is going down year on year. Some areas we've seen sort of 75% decreases in insect abundance. There's been some very well documented impacts on honeybees and wild bees from the use of pesticides. Hedgehog numbers have declined massively, in part due to sort of land use changes, but also because they're losing food sources because we're poisoning them with pesticides. We have lost, since the end of the Second World War, 95% of our wildflower meadows, not all due to pesticide use, but a lot of it to do with the way we farm. And the way we farm is a result of having access to pesticides, so it is sort of tangentially responsible for that. And you can apply this to bats, toads, frogs, voles, the whole range of things. Pesticides are having an impact. And they're not just impacting biodiversity; they're found in our food. We have pesticide residues in the food that we all eat every single day, unless we're on a completely organic diet, and I suspect most of us aren't. And it's not just one or two pesticides. There are pesticide cocktails. So, for example, we've seen samples of grapes with 17 or 18 different pesticide residues on them, and the quite worrying thing about that is that we don't actually know what these cocktails are doing. We don't know how these things are interacting with us, and that can be also looked at in the wider environment. We don't know what all the pesticides are doing in conjunction with each other to the things out there. Pesticides are regulated on an individual basis, and absolutely no attention is given to how they interact either with themselves, with each other, or with all the other chemicals that we release into the environment. Fruit and vegetables are the most problematic in terms of food, but it's not just related to them. There are 50% of the bread samples, this was from last year, contained multiple pesticide residues. And amongst these residues are carcinogens and endocrine disrupting chemicals and developmental and reproductive toxins. And if you want to have a look more closely at that, we do a specific section of our website that focuses on food and what you might find in that. I apologise now that none of this is an overly joyful presentation. I get to do this, but anyway, I'm here to talk about pesticide free towns and what you can do. And I had a quick look actually at what's happening in Essex, and there's a lot of positive stuff going on. There are campaigns running in, I just picked out 6 sort of at the top. I think there are a few more than that: Frinton, Colchester, Braintree, Chelmsford, Romford and Basildon. And of those, Colchester and Chelmsford have taken steps to reduce and end the use of pesticides in certain sections. So there is stuff already going on in Essex, and congratulations if you're part of that, and I hope those people that are doing things will help inspire those that aren't to take things further. But our Pesticide Free Towns campaign, which has been running for about 7 years now, was inspired by what was happening in Europe. There'd been a lot of activity in France, where at that point they had about 400 towns, villages, cities that had banned the use of pesticides in their upkeep. Since then, France has banned completely the use of non-agricultural pesticides. So there's nothing used on the streets, pavements, parks, playgrounds in France. Equally, all of Belgium, Luxembourg's towns and cities are managed without pesticides, and there's it's happening all across Europe, and there's the potential that in the next year or so the EU will completely ban the use of pesticides in towns and cities in all 27 member states. So what we started off with was providing information for local communities so that they could lobby their councils for change. We created a sort of suite of materials that anybody could use. It was free of charge. You could do that, set up your own campaign. We'd advise you how to do it. We'll give you sort of technical information, etc. We currently work closely with councils across the UK, and there's been quite a positive change in the last 3 years, whereby it's no longer sort of local people pushing their councils to do this. We're getting councils coming directly to us to ask how they can reduce pesticides. So we provide a wealth of advice and information on well, things from alternatives to dealing with costs and obstacles and creating policies and putting motions into the council. The whole range of things. Again, it's all available freely to anybody who wants it. Currently, we have about 80 councils in the UK who are taking some action, whether that's looking at alternatives or ending the use in parks and green spaces, or looking to reduce pesticides, or going for a full ban, and that ranges from sort of parish council right up to county council level. And we've got, it's actually more than 100, it's about 120 plus local campaigns at the length and breadth of the UK. And our ultimate goal really with this is to show that it's possible to manage towns, cities, villages, green spaces, etc., without the use of pesticides, which it is, and also that this is something that is wanted by both the public and by a lot of councils in the UK, and we're aiming for a national ban to follow the French and potentially the EU example, because ultimately there is no need whatsoever for us to be spraying pesticides, which are poisons, in the areas where we live, work, and play. So how does it work, I suppose, is the next question. Well, no, what are the benefits? Why? We'll come on to how it works. So what are the benefits? So already seen, the use of pesticides has a huge impact on both the environment and biodiversity. So by ending their use, we will be reducing pollution in air, ground, and water. Herbicide use, which is the vast majority of pesticides that are used in the amenity setting, is used mainly on hard surfaces, impermeable surfaces, and this is a big source of water pollution when it runs off down the drains and gutters, etc., which can a significant cost for local authorities. Biodiversity, we've seen the impacts on pollinating insects and other beneficial insects, but also on soil microorganisms, birds, amphibians, also on pets as well. And we've got a report coming out later this year on how pesticides in the urban setting can harm our companion animals. And protecting citizens, some of the most vulnerable groups, and amongst those are our children who use our parks and green spaces, and they are some of the most vulnerable to the short-term and the long-term impacts of exposure to pesticides. So going pesticide-free will help protect some of the most vulnerable groups in society. Staff, so people that use pesticides are often the ones that can feel some of the most harmful impacts. There have been some very high profile cases related to glyphosate and exposure of workers, groundskeepers and the like in the US, where millions and millions of pounds have been paid out in damages for them being poisoned as a result of their workday life. So not using them means you're not really exposing council staff to pesticides. We actually had the GMB call for a ban on the use of glyphosate to protect its members and the public from the potential harms of that. Getting ahead of the game, there are going to be changes in pesticide regulations. We're expecting a thing called the National Action Plan on Pesticides at some point this year. It is already 5 years late, but it has been promised it will be out this year. We are expecting there to be some restrictions in the use of pesticides in public areas. Likewise, glyphosate its renewal is being discussed in the EU this year, and in 2025 the same will happen in the UK. Again, we're expecting the EU to place restrictions on its use in public areas, which will have a knock-on effect in the UK. So getting ahead of the game, so you're not left with things being taken out of use and suddenly scratching your head about how are we going to do things. So get started now. Reducing your costs. We've seen from the UK, from the EU rather, and other places where long-term adoption of pesticide-free techniques has actually resulted in cost savings over the longer term. So once new systems get embedded, once new management systems are in place, and etc., costs will come down, particularly if you have to have some initial outlay on equipment, etc. But cost shouldn't be an issue that stops you doing this. And as a selling point to the public are really keen to see pesticide reductions, whether that's in agriculture or in our towns and cities. Polling regularly shows that sort of approximately 70% of the public want to see fewer pesticides used, wherever that happens to be. So there is that. There are also a number of things that sort of councils are going to be obliged to do. So addressing the climate emergency, pesticides are often ignored in terms of their impact on climate, but pesticides are not carbon neutral or carbon negative. In fact, many are made from fossil fuels. There is a carbon budget in the whole life cycle, from manufacturing to packaging, delivery, use, and disposal, particularly disposal, where they have to be incinerated. Helping meet whatever measures you may have under a biodiversity action plan. So one of the key aspects of a pesticide-free policy or approach is to have areas that you no longer, sort of mow back, trim back, or whatever it happens to be. So you're actually creating bigger areas of biodiversity. So helping meet that. There is a statutory requirement for councils to remove detritus from curbs and roadsides and that sort of thing. And actually doing that means you're removing habitat for weeds to develop, so you haven't got a problem going forward. Makes things easier. And then there are net gain requirements that are sort of being placed on councils to deliver more biodiversity. So going pesticide free can help you meet all of these various sort of pledges and requirements that you will have or will be placed upon you. So how do we achieve it? There are these four sort of bullet points here are really the key headline things that you need to take into account when you're developing a plan, when you've decided to go pesticide free, when you start phasing things out. So there is no silver bullet. You can't and you won't replace the use of glyphosate or other herbicides with one particular thing. It just doesn't work like that. Glyphosate and herbicides are popular for a reason. They're relatively cheap. They do the job incredibly well, and they're easy-ish to apply. So there isn't a like-for-like swapping out. You need to have a clear policy framework. You need to know where you're going, what you hope to achieve, and who is going to be involved in that, and how they're going to be involved in that. And you need it to be time-based and measurable, so you can set yourself goals that you can meet as you head along. And it needs to be realistic and not too ambitious, which brings me on to the next point, is that it takes time. So even with the best will in the world, and there have been a lot of people with a lot of goodwill who want to get this done immediately, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next week or the week after or the year after. This is something that takes sort of 2, 3, 4 years to do, because you're adopting a whole new way of thinking about things, a whole new approach. Council officers need to be educated in new systems. You have to understand the area that you're doing. You have to look at areas and really see what works and what doesn't work, because there is, similar to there being no silver bullet, there's no one size fits all solution for everywhere, because every single area is different in terms of geography, what you have to maintain, the type of weeds that you have, and the type of levels of control that you want to achieve. And then the fourth one on this, they're all equally important, but the fourth one is communication is key. So you really need to work with the public so that they understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the benefits are, and what they can expect to see. And getting them on side is absolutely vital. So we'll have a look at some a little bit more detail. So cheapest alternative to pesticide use is to do nothing. This is a quote from John Burke, who was a councillor in Hackney, who was responsible for massive reductions in pesticide use. And they just withdrew spraying from many areas, including some of the housing estates and green spaces. And obviously it didn't cost them anything. And they had a lot of wildflowers spring up. So that might not be appropriate for everywhere, but it certainly is part of the approach. And it's one of my favourite ones as well, because it costs nothing and you get more species. In fact, on one of the housing estates where they stopped spraying, they had in the first season 27 native and wild species self-seed in that first season, and they put up little signs for the public to help them identify them and really got them on side, and it was fantastic. It looked great. So preventative measures. So as I think we found out during the pandemic, prevention is better than a cure. So designing spaces that are weed unfriendly, which is something to think about going forward. So do you want to use tarmac? Do you want to use whatever it happens to be? Can you design spaces better? Can you make sure that there aren't corners where debris, soil, etc., can build up that might become habitats for weeds to stop you having a problem in the future? So using membranes under paths and paving is particularly useful in sort of green spaces. That will stop weeds coming through. Cover planting, so growing native species or other types that can outcompete weeds and look nice in their own right. There's some really great work being done on that in some of the parts of green spaces I've seen, particularly in Europe, where they do a lot of that, and have really adopted sort of native species that actually may have once been called weeds, but are really nice in sort of borders and beds. And then there's mulching, which is a classic, so around trees or wherever it happens to be, and there are different types of mulch that you can use to suppress and stop weeds. There are the old-fashioned ways, so hoeing, raking, mowing, and hand weeding. And whilst there are labour costs potentially involved with this, it can be very effective depending on how you do it. So a couple of things that sort of spring to mind is some councils have adopted a reactive system, whereby if a resident has concerns about weed because it's blocking access or there's a trip hazard, etc., they can call up a specific phone number and the team will come out and deal with that on the same day. And it's important that there is a specific number and that the public can be reassured that it will be dealt with, and it is gone out and dealt with. Another way is to we've seen streets and local communities sort of opt out of spraying, but make an agreement with the council to keep it at a certain level, and they'll go out and keep control of the weeds, which is a great way of engendering community spirit. And then there are all sorts of volunteer groups, green groups, etc., who are sort of interested in doing this kind of thing and actually getting them on board. Again, you'll be drawing the community into it, but you'll also be getting the job done at no extra cost necessarily to the council. So the old-fashioned way it works as part of your project, your plan. So there's sort of the new-fashioned way, which is some of the machineries and technologies that have come around. So hot water has been quite popular, but has sort of fallen by the wayside somewhat and been replaced by hot foam, such as Foam Stream. These kill plants by basically boiling them, and actually if you're near it, it smells like, I don't know, your grandma's sprouts in December when she puts them on to boil ready for Christmas. And what the foam does, it's an inert vegetable oil that actually keeps the water hotter for longer, so you get a more effective thing to kill the weeds, sort of down to the root level, but it also sterilizes seeds, so you're not going to have problems further on. And actually Foam Stream also gets rid of moss and chewing gum and a whole range of other things as well, so actually it's multifunctional. Electricity is a developing area. Again, it works in a very similar way. It passes a current through the plant, which will kill it all the way down to the root. It's not great for huge areas and vast swathes, but it's really good for dealing with invasive species like Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed and that sort of thing. And flame weeding and brushing. Brushing has been adopted by a number of places. Hounslow use it on their highways and pavements, and a number of other places are adopting it as well. Brushing will not only rip out the weeds, it'll also help keep the streets clean, so you can ensure that, again, there aren't habitats for weeds to develop. So they are very useful. I was just down in Plymouth last week, and they're running trials on spot flame treating weeds in certain areas to see how that works out in conjunction with brushing and sweeping as well. So again, it's this idea that you need a number of approaches that are suitable for each particular area if you're going to adopt a properly integrated and holistic weed management scheme. Invasive species is an issue that always comes up, and there are some requirements on councils and others that you have to deal with invasive species. And frankly, things like knotweed, there's very little that will deal with it really effectively. But that said, even glyphosate doesn't deal with it particularly effectively. You can treat, you can spray, but it still comes back. All the things that I've just discussed will give you a level of control similar to glyphosate. And they're also useful for other things. So foam streaming, particularly, you can use it in water because it's not harmful to aquatic systems, so it can deal with things like crassula. The picture you can see on the top right there is this mesh tech, which has been developed by a company called Japanese Knotweed Solutions for dealing with knotweed. Again, it takes time, but you lay this mesh, just sort of like fine chicken wire type thing, over the area where you have the problem. The knotweed grows up through it, the tuber swells, it cuts itself off, and after a few seasons of doing that, it will so weaken the plant down to the roots that it will die. But again, it takes a bit of time. If you have to use glyphosate or other herbicides, and I imagine many of you will, rather than spraying it so that you don't get drift, you don't use too much, you don't impact other flora in the area, stem injection is the best way to go. It also works for hogweed and other things as well, but you're injecting the herbicide directly into the plant, so you'll use less, it will be more effective, and you won't have exposure to for things that you don't want to expose to pesticides. And then root wave, which is the electronic system, which I mentioned above, that's the picture bottom right. Yeah, it's really good for, well, not only sort of hogweed and knotweed and that sort of thing, but it's also great for docks and thistles and other sort of woodier, tougher sort of weeds or plants. And actually, there's been quite a lot of development to make that much more manageable and user friendly. So I'll just show you a little bit of what happened in Strasbourg in France. And I think it highlights how you really need a joined up approach to this. So in 2008, the council there decided to go pesticide free. What they then had to do was train council workers in some of the new techniques, but they also worked on outreach to the public and convinced them accepting a slightly higher level of weediness was something that would be of benefit to everyone and the environment in general. So they had a proper communications and publicity campaign. They used a range of different things. At the time, it was mechanical brushes, flame weeders and steam. But they also used a range of different things, planting and layout techniques that would deal with weeds naturally, so things like cover planting, but also making use of native species, perennials, not using the sort of the showy annuals that you often see in beds in green spaces, which have absolutely no use to pollinators, and you have to replace them every year at huge cost. So thinking about what you're actually putting in can both save you money but also benefit the biodiversity. And they also did a lot in terms of differentiating between areas that needed weeding and actually those that could be left to go wild. what we find is that a lot of councils will have a kind of spray by numbers particular approach, particularly if they use a contractor. So they'll say we need X kilometres of pavements treated 3 times a year, whether they need it or not. And actually, one of the things we've found with a number of councils is that they've gone from 3 sprays a year down to 1 spray a year, and they're maintaining the exact same level of control that they did, but saving themselves money and time, and reducing the amount of herbicides that are applied to their streets. So I think this is quite nice from the UNESCO report, because Strasbourg is a World Heritage Site, and this was from their report in 2016. The zero pesticide policy in Strasbourg is changing the vegetation of the urban green spaces, with weeds previously destroyed now being a feature of the landscape design. And again, this comes down to what we think of weeds and the sort of language we use. So, weeds are plants that are in the wrong place, and weeds are actually plants that are in their own right are absolutely, can be very beautiful. They can provide much needed sources of food and shelter for biodiversity, etc. So we've sort of started trying to call them pavement plants, and to that end, we're about to publish a thing called the Pavement Plant Guide that actually talks about what weeds are and what they could and should be. So we do a whole range of different things, particularly for things that are applicable to councils. So we've got a guide for local authorities that sort of covers all the key issues. We've got a whole range of case studies from the UK, but also from more widely across Europe. We're happy to help with public communication. We can introduce people to suppliers of alternatives, but we can also introduce you to other towns and cities that are going along this process. Some of the things that we published recently is a guide to costs, on how you can offset costs and change things around so there isn't a cost issue. So we have got an awful lot of materials, and all of these are free for you to use as you see fit. We've got information on how you develop a pesticide policy, what goes into that, what you need to do, and we're always happy to talk to anybody directly or come and meet with people, etc. So this is a bit about what people as individuals can do, because I think that's also an important aspect of this. So if your council's going pesticide free and you've got hundreds of gardeners still applying pesticides, then it's a bit of a sort of cancels it out a little bit. So again, encouraging the public to go pesticide free, so you can, if they can ditch the chemicals, they can buy organic where possible, and get their hands dirty. So the public have an important role to play in this as well. And I shall leave you with this phrase, which is my favourite one from Silent Spring, which was published 60 years ago last year, which I find a bit alarming. So Rachel Carson wrote this as a warning about what we could be facing if we didn't get on top of our pesticide use, and it was particularly focused on DDT, which has been banned. But we're still facing the same kind of things as we were 60 years ago, perhaps at a more accelerated rate. So I think the idea that we might see a silent spring is a little bit closer. I think we have ignored the warnings from 60 years ago that she so clearly put out, and I think it would be ironic if we determine our future by something as seemingly trivial as the choice of insect or indeed a herbicide spray. So I shall leave it at that, and then I hope that you might have questions, or we can have a bit of discussion about the issue in general.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was really, really useful. I personally am very excited for the plants pavement guide. That sounds pretty awesome. It reminds me of, I think there's a group down in the southwest that go around and chalk the names of the various different plants that pop up along the pavements. So
yeah, I mean, they've been doing great stuff in Plymouth and really helped deliver stuff and encourage people, but also get the public involved as well. And that's, it's really, doing things like that is a really easy way of getting people on side and making positive change. So several years ago, I was in one of the London boroughs, and I was being taken around by an officer, and he was hugely excited to show me this big area that he'd left to go wild, and it looked fantastic. But he said, I'm getting so many complaints from the public about this. And I said, well, just put a sign in that say we're doing this for the bees, and have a couple of the plants that you see there, and see what happens. So he did. A couple of weeks later, he said, I've never had so many calls and emails from the public saying, can we have more of this? And this is great work. It can be really simple just to get people on side.
Absolutely. I find that signs mean that people take a second look and they actually look at the plants or the flowers or whatever it might be, and they can often be more beautiful than you might have realised.
Yeah, and it also helps show that actually this isn't being neglected, or it's not, it's not just
Yeah,
being
it's
left,
not
this is
cost
being
saving yet.
done for a purpose. So yeah.
Absolutely. We've just got a question from Elaine. She's put, I'm interested in this guide too. When will it be published? So
We are just getting it sort of signed off, and finding a couple more pictures and trying to identify a couple of the plants that are in there. It should be within the next couple of weeks. It'll be available on our website. I think it's my best guess. I suppose realistically, within the next month.
Perfect. Well, what I'll do, I'll keep an eye out. We've got a Team Wilder newsletter, which most people here are signed up to. So once I see it, I can then send it through so everyone can access it via that. If you're not signed up to the Team Wilder newsletter, you'll have a chance to do that in my follow-up email later this evening. So yeah, I will send any links through there, as well as all the other bits and bobs regarding Pesticide Free Town.
Sorry, just to also answer Linda's other question. I'm more than happy if you want to circulate I can send it to you, the presentation, if you actually want to circulate the presentation itself, the slides as well, recording. I'm happy for that to be done, and for anyone who wasn't here can have it as well.
That would be great. Yes, the slides would be good. And then what we will do is this recording goes on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it back or send it to other councillors or other people in your area. Okay. Another question here from Elaine. What do you advise to do with these old nasties in the shed? So Roundup, etc., etc. Good question.
It is a great question, actually, and it is a great question. And there are some really nasty things. What we have tried to encourage people to do is also local communities to have, or councils to do a pesticide amnesty, where people can bring them all into one place and then they will be taken to a proper disposal site. We helped organise one in Guernsey, and the stuff that came out of people's sheds there was unbelievable. There were things that had been banned years ago, sort of all sorts of things, and I mean hundreds and hundreds of stuff, things turned up. The problem is every council should have a dedicated garden chemical disposal site at their recycling centre or wherever it happens to be. Many don't, and even if they do, many don't advertise it because it costs them money to do it and they don't like it. So I would say try and find a disposal site. I would also suggest perhaps organising a community amnesty where people can come and hand it in and it can be taken away. You'd have to obviously organise that with your waste disposal team and the relevant site, etc. But that can be a really good way, of getting rid of them in the first place. But then also, again, it's an opportunity to speak to the public about what's going on. I think you might find the response interesting. Bristol have already had one. I think there was one somewhere else as well. So it's not impossible to do. And it might be something interesting to organise. I'd be happy to all chat further about that if anybody in any Essex council would be interested in maybe taking something forward along the lines of an amnesty.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that would be a fantastic idea. Never considered that before, because you're right, lots of tips don't take them. Often it's in the same area as the paint, but as you say, it's not advertised.
And I mean, even me, so when my dad passed away, I was cleaning out a shed. My God, there was some stuff in there. There was one in just some container that said insect killer fungicide. I don't know what that was, and all sorts of other things. But then trying to find someone to dispose of it was really difficult. And there's quite a lot to suggest that people will, because they haven't got a clear route for disposal, it just goes down the drain or into a waterway, or it's tossed out. And that has a huge impact, or it can have a huge impact. But I mean, on just also slightly on the same sort of subject, we've been working to try and stop, in the first instance, supermarkets selling pesticides, and I'm happy to report that 3 of them have taken sort of synthetic pesticides, including glyphosate, off their shelves, and I imagine others will follow suit. So, but France has banned the sale of pesticides to the public, and people are still managing to garden all right. So again, that's something that we would really like to see adopted.
Yeah, absolutely. I can vouch for that. My garden is pesticide free, and it's not difficult. I don't garden a huge amount. It's just, you keep ticking it over. And actually, it's more interesting because you get to find out what's there in the first instance, rather than going around and spraying and then possibly not seeing what might pop up. So yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to the amnesty as well, if you're at the beginning of your journey, launching your kind of pesticide policy alongside doing that might be a really good way of involving as many local residents as possible. Because everybody, if they've got a shed, there's probably an old bit of pesticide in there. So
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, are there any other questions? Because if not, we will wrap it up there. But thank you everybody for attending tonight. And as we both mentioned, we're happy to do follow-up questions, and I can link any council who's interested up with Nick. Oh, we've got another one here. Yes, dandelions are a key one, absolutely. They are absolutely wonderful pollinators, and as you say, also great for us. You can pretty much eat every part of the dandelion. So yes, I would refer to them not as weeds, but to lovely yellow first spring flowers that bring a sense of joy as soon as I see them.
And you can also eat knotweed as well. So if you really got knotweed problems, you could turn it into a soup or a pesto.
You can, absolutely.
I've no idea what it tastes like. So I mean,
apparently similar to rhubarb. I believe there is a restaurant in London that is doing a knotweed festival at some point and testing out various different recipes. So there you go.
Excellent. Oh well,
Yeah.
I shall have to look into that and get down there in that case.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you very much, Nick, for your time this evening.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much, and I hope to take this forward even further in Essex than it already is.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.